I had a question. I know it's probably like this, but I don't think I ever heard anyone say it out loud. But did Ellen White ever have any visions of our time, or it was only her time, right? Because that's when Christ was supposed to come. So she never saw our timeline. We're just making application on our time.
I haven't spoken of this, but I believe that Elder Parminder has. And from what I've understood from the quotes he's gone through, the studies he's gone through, Ellen White is particularly given light for those two models. And we have to approach her writings through those two models. So she isn't writing, for example, she didn't write something and see a vision in the future and see Twin Towers fall at 9/11 in New York City. She didn't see that. What we do is we go back to her writings and understand the two failed histories and understand them then for our own. And when we do that, people accuse us of destroying the writings of the prophet, which is the same thing that Christ was accused of through his use of the writings of Moses. But Moses also, up until his final vision, which is not recorded, he had light for, in his light he saw the nation of Israel successfully doing that job, not its fall at 34 AD. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I thought, because ever since we started taking her writings in context, it seems clear, if you're taking it in context, that it was for her time, in her timeline, both of those models. So
yes,
it makes sense.
And it doesn't mean that we treat it any lighter. In fact, it shows, from my perspective, it shows even more the power of God, because when you read a quote, sorry?
And a bigger warning, because of the fact that they had opportunity to fail. It's like a huge warning. It's really serious.
Yes. But when we read something where she says Christ will return in your own history, that's why people leave Adventism. They leave Adventism because they're saying you're following a false prophet and I'll prove it to you. She says this and she says this, and they'll tear apart her writings. But when we understand the structures that God was working with, and we go and we place them where they are, those quotes that people use to discredit her are actually demonstrated as being inspired, and that it really was, it makes the picture through structure look that much more beautiful. I think if we look at this message with the correct perspective, the way we then treat her writings is not with disrespect, but it shows the power of God and what he was attempting to do, and how he was attempting to push his people to do the work they were intended.
Amen. Thank you.
There's a question. It's a question from Brother Brendan, asking what event marked the close of probation in Millerite history in 1861. I don't want to give an answer to that like I'm saying this is the close of probation. I don't want to do that because I don't think we've looked at that history close enough. But I do find it interesting that the fellow who co-wrote the 1850 Compromise died on the same day as the first skirmish of the Civil War occurred. His death and that first battle line up by the day. And his name, I'll find his name. I think I've lost that I've closed that page. We'll discuss that next week. Not necessarily to give a day, I'm not trying to make hard application, at least yet, but just to speak of the events, the history that there's between 1798 and 1863 there are 15 US presidents. I think between 1840 and 1863, how many years is that? 1840 to 1863, it's 23 years. In 23 years, there were 8 US presidents. If 8 US presidents each serve 1 4-year term, how many years is that? 32. So in 23 years, you have 8 US presidents, which should have been at minimum a 32-year period. So you're talking about a history when there is a lot going on, a lot politically, a lot of turmoil externally. So we need to have a better understanding of Millerite history if we're to understand our own. Brother Blessing, I get the feeling I missed a question before from your statement. Please illustrate and shed a bit of light on the chiasm that connects Gethsemane with Christ in the wilderness. I hope my question is clear. It's very clear. So I'm sorry if I missed a question before. The chiasm that connects Gethsemane with Christ in the wilderness. All that has been done there is take the two reform lines we have from that history. We are both the disciples, the first group called, and we're also Christ being that priesthood. He is the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. In that fashion, he represents the movement. So when we look at his 30 years of training and then his preparation to go to work, his life in that training for the priesthood fashion illustrates the priesthood today. So we take the history of the theme of Christ as the priesthood and also the disciples as the first group trained, and we form 2 reform lines from the end of ancient Israel. When we do that, it shows us that we have, and I'll draw it again, that when we have the shut door waymark for the first group, if anyone's new, we're not talking about a moral close of probation. We're not talking about the end of intercession, but it's a key testing point for that first group of people. Up above, this is the theme of the disciples. First group. Down below, this is Christ as the priest. The 30 years of training every priest was required to undergo. That brings us to his baptism. And this all lines up with 2019. When we take these 2 different lines, this line, the disciples, the first group called, show us Gethsemane before the cross. And then the disciples go into their time of trouble. This line, which is Christ's training as a priest, shows us his 30 years of preparation, and then it shows us the wilderness time period. And when you go to the writings of Ellen White, I don't have the quote in front of me, but she lines these 2 up. And she compares and contrasts them to these 2. This is the first great test where Satan and Christ personally battle. She says if he fails here, the plan of redemption is entirely lost. She lines up Gethsemane. That was the last time that Christ battled Satan. That's a one-on-one fight. And if Christ loses here, the plan of redemption is eternally lost. So these are the 2 battles where Christ is weakened, where that quote, his form was marred more than any of the sons of men, his visage. That quote is from the Old Testament, is applied to both histories. Both histories he's weak, both histories he's attacked. both histories, he must have victory. So it's taking that those two different lines from the end of ancient Israel. And when she speaks about Gethsemane, it's actually in the chapter of Desire of Ages when she speaks about him in the wilderness. It's his wilderness time period. So Ellen White quite neatly makes that link. And when we bring it to our own time, we see we have these back-to-back tests, which are quite serious. I hope that answers the question. There's a couple of questions I'm sorry that I don't think I'm quite understanding. So if I'm not answering, there's a couple of questions that I don't think I'm getting the point of the questioner. Sister Margaret says, did the priests study for 30 years or did they have to be adults of 30 or more years? I don't think I'm quite understanding that one either, but it was essentially from the time, and again I don't have those Old Testament quotes where they said you can't be a priest until you've reached 30 years of age, because they needed that preparation. And from the time that they were essentially infants, they were to be taught on the knees of their parents. They were to be taught the work of the priesthood. So this isn't as if they, in that 30 years, they were negligent of their duty, that they were trained through that. The same way you see Christ being trained, because Christ followed the same model. He could not perform his work as a priest after the order of Melchizedek till he had reached 30 years of age. And through those 30 years, he is preparing and training for his work, whether it's on the knee of Mary or by the time he's in the synagogue reasoning with the Pharisees, you already see the results of the training that he's in. Or whether it's the carpenter's workshop, Ellen White goes into some explanation of that training period. The sister asks, what is the clue that we are really in the time of trouble? I would suggest that the evidence for that is the structure itself. So it's the structure that actually placed, if I was to go back to share screen again, and we were to go back to the end of ancient Israel and the end of modern Israel, it's the structure of the reform lines themselves that place us in the harvest time of the first group. It's the fact that we're after the cross, the close of probation of the first group, approaching Pentecost. I keep repeating this phrase, but I find it consistently fascinating that the Gospels are all illustrated. The Gospels, somewhat into the book of Acts, are all pre-34 AD. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and part of the book of Acts are all there to explain to us the history from the time of the end to 34 AD. The amount of effort that God has gone to illustrate the history prior to the gospel going to the Gentiles, prior to the message going to the world at the Sunday law. What he's showing us in those gospels is the preparation of a people to be able to go to the world. That's the power of the Gospels. Then it's not to discount the beautiful moral messages in them, But what they are illustrating is the experience that God's people must have before they are equipped to go to the world at the Sunday law. And the problem with Adventism is they're blind to any of this. They're just waiting for this event. And if the Jews are just waiting blindly for 34 AD, are they going to be ready? No, they don't have a hope of being prepared for 34 AD. This is the shipwreck of Acts 27. They were already, they'd already failed by then. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, into Acts 27 is illustrating, is all to illustrate the training and preparation for that work. So these structures themselves illustrate that we are in this fractal of a time of trouble. It isn't this death decree message of the second advent time of trouble that we understand here, but it does occur on a fractal level. And if we look externally, we do see that. We see that externally. We see that through what is occurring now. That there is, while we don't have the death decree on a fractal level, you have a shadow of that time period. The fires in Australia, the locusts through the Middle East and Africa, even heading into Brazil, the pandemic, the protests, the social unrest. It's been a year that any worldly person finds quite unbelievable. And as someone just said, it's only half over. Someone said, I thought 2014 was typified by a change of leadership. Yes, I agree with that. That's what you see occur in that time period. That's what was occurring with the first temple cleansing of Christ. John the Baptist recognized that when that temple was cleansed, that the disciples were to cease following him and were to turn towards Christ. He recognized what was happening with that first temple cleansing. So I fully agree with you. Someone has asked me a question on equality. I might not answer that for now if you don't mind, because it looks like a more complex question and I'm not sure of your personal life. So I would encourage you, either I will try to address that in another presentation, or if you have difficulties, to speak to your leadership or contact me directly. And it could be done, I think, better than in a short question and answer. I know that this issue of equality, many people are facing various obstacles to in their personal lives, and also there still exists some confusion. If I'm not answering your question, it's because I either don't understand your question or I don't know the answer, so I'm hiding from you. And there's a couple I don't understand. I'm sorry. Someone asked me if it's sexist for married women to change their last name. I would say, of course it is. The society is built around that. We can look at the dowry system and see the sexism that exists there, but why do we teach in conservative culture that a boy must go and ask the permission of the parents of the woman to marry her? Why is it the boy that goes and asks the permission of the parents of the daughter? It's because he's taking something that belongs to them. They have some ownership over her that does not exist between the son and his parents. So he's asking, without bringing the money, he's asking that those parents of the daughter, do I have permission to take what belongs to you and make her belong to myself. So these issues, this sexism is ingrained in, I have never seen a culture worldwide that doesn't have sexism ingrained in it. I'm not saying we don't ask, we should ask the advice, the counsel and the permission of parents, but we should try and do that with equality and be aware how much inequality, how much nationalism and sexism is baked into the culture, whatever country that you're from. Why does a father give his daughter away when he walks her down the aisle? Everyone, whether they're from Africa and they're paying dowry, or whether they're from Australia and they're walking their daughter down the aisle, can try and paint these things as somehow beautiful traditions, but they're not. They're ingrained in sexism. My parents just took a hint. Sorry. It's okay, I'm not getting married that I know of. I don't, without proper studies on these things, I don't kind of want to give short answers, because some of the questions I recognise are quite complex. So someone has asked, the 1 + 2 = 3, what do we put under the 3 as we have under the 1 and 2? So I don't think I have been precise in giving the dates for that. 1858 is the publication of spiritual gifts. 1888 is the publication of the Great Controversy, but they're not exactly published on the same day as the waymarks they're alluding to. Spiritual Gifts is published 8 years after the 1850 Compromise. 1888, the Great Controversy, is looking forward to an imminent Sunday law in the United States. So I haven't tried to be precise in those dates, 1858, 1888, like I'm marking them as the waymarks. I'm marking them, I'm trying to place those writings into the context of the history that they were written in. So under the 3, all that I've tried to be vague about is that we're in a third history without necessarily marking a solid date. Where it's the third history. If I can keep it as vague at that for the moment. Someone asked, despite what I've said, the Bible is full of stories of women following the men away from their families. Male dominion? Yes, it's written entirely in the society and context that it required. Just as it does with nationalism. As I said, when you go to the writings of Ellen White and read them in context, when we go back to those stories, we're going back to a society that we would no longer live under. Back with the baggage that they still carried in those societies. And many of their other practices, we do this all the time. We go back to that history, we identify this was how society operated back then, and we would never attempt to apply it today. This is just one more example of how we should be careful going back and seeing that. For example, I'm not talking about things like Sabbath keeping, universal everlasting rules and principles to live by. But when you go back and you see the things like hot war, and how the Jews went into Canaan and wiped out the population, things like that, where people are restrained by the practices of their own time. Someone asked about, can we do something about the surname dilemma, the last name, as far as legal issues are concerned, where names have already been changed, legal documents, identity, proof of marriage, etc. I'm not so concerned about that practice because I know situations where the man has chosen to take the last name of his wife at marriage, and they are much more rare, but that still occurs. And for those reasons, if people choose to do that, I don't see that as a sin because it can be done both ways. But we should be aware of why we're doing it and where these practices come from. But men can change their last name, women can change their last name. I think that we should, if we're going to ask the question, are these things rooted in a sexist culture? The answer is clearly yes. That's where they originate from. In fact, they've done studies. You go back 200 years, a woman wasn't even known by her first name. I would be, if I don't want to name anyone now because there might be a man by that name. John Smith. If I married a John Smith, I would be Mrs. John Smith. They had to even take on the first name of their husband. And the difficulty they have now is the women a couple hundred years ago, when that practice was normal, it's very difficult to locate those women in documents for what they were able to accomplish. There's women who accomplished great things in that history where it's hard to even find their story or anything about them, because everything that you would look up about them is directed entirely to their husband. The reason being, nothing was put under their name, not even their first name. They lost their identity. When they lost their identity, they also lost their legacy. And it's hard to actually find recorded information about them because it's sunk deep inside this system where they're not known by their name. I'll take one. How long have we been going for? Take one more question, and then we're going to close. A brother asked, in November last year, you mentioned the 2 streams of information for the counterfeit, and you also mentioned there were 2 streams in Adventism that could be represented in the same way, but didn't expand upon it in that study. Could you expand on which of those streams? Or in case you mentioned them in another study, could you mention where? I can't point you to a study. I don't think one has been done. I do expect we will study that more. How I would like to answer, I guess if I could in just a few sentences, is essentially what we've done here. When we line up, there's these 2 streams within Protestantism, and you have this socially conservative stream built on conspiracy theories and how that took us to Walter Weiss. So, when we look at the United States and we see 2 streams, we see CNN and Fox. Now, we don't necessarily just say it's just them. Under Fox News comes all different other people, other organisations, other headings. Breitbart News would come under that heading that we call Fox. I have a mind blank of the others at the moment. But Fox just becomes like a title of a particular methodology, a particular worldview. So we would say Fox News and CNN, and they become just titles of a mindset and a worldview. I believe it's the same within Protestantism, that you have these 2 opposing streams with 2 opposing worldviews. And I guess without being too precise, without a proper study, Weiss definitely heads or is involved in the false stream. Anyone following Walter Weiss and his worldview, he's anti-globalist, he's nationalist, he's racist, he's sexist, homophobic, conspiratorial. worldview will be very difficult to reach with this message. They're already struggling on that test, on their ploughing, early rain, and latter rain. When we look at the lines we had up before, to sound what many people might find horrific, there is true information in Adventism. Not true for this movement, because they are the people we will be able to reach and educate, but such publications as Spectrum magazine are fighting against Walter Weiss' worldview. So you do have this fight between two worldviews in Adventism, just as you do in Protestantism, just as you do in the United States, just as you do in Catholicism. And I don't support everything Spectrum publishes, just like I don't support everything CNN publishes. They are not aware of the truth of this movement. But as far as preparing people with a correct worldview to accept the truth of this movement, one side is leading them to accept, one side is leading them towards conspiracy theories and nationalism. So I would suggest that Weiss becomes really a title heading for this wrong worldview in Adventism that's leading Levites away from the possibility of accepting this message. So I might close it there. Thank you for engaging with me. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I'm sorry if I didn't answer them properly, but it was a real blessing to see you all again. And I don't mind if you don't have your camera on, that's completely fine. I don't when I'm on, but the faces I did get to see were a delight too. So I'm going to close now, and everyone can speak if they wish, continue to dialogue. I hope you all have a happy Sabbath. Thank you. God bless.